Should I use Linux for programming? So I'm in the second semester on my university, and we do C programming. I am currently using Windows 11, and most of senior years recommend using Linux. Should I change? On July 1st, on Reddit www.reddit.com/comment/12quegum, an update regarding Reddit's API change to Reddit's API pricing will come into effect. But reddit.com/Reddit is fun, comments 144 GMFQ. Reddit will shut down on June 30, 2023 in response to. Several developers of commercial third-party apps have announced that this change will compel them to shut down their apps. At least, Erigris www.comments45 ESK updates will continue operating for free. One accessibility-focused, non-commercial third-party app will continue to be available free of charge. If you want to express your strong disagreement with the API pricing change or with Reddit's response to the backlash, you may want to consider the following options. Limiting your involvement with Reddit, or temporarily refraining from using Reddit, canceling your subscription of Reddit Premium as a way to voice your protest. I am a bot, and this action was performed automatically. Please reference message compose /learn programming. Contact the moderators of this subreddit if you have any questions or concerns. You can seg fault on any OS, really. Gotta catch 'em all. Should? Definitely not. I would personally use it, though. I feel like Linux is much more integrated with terminals, and they're an essential part of programming. Using the terminal in Windows just feels wonky, and yes, that includes USL. Being a programmer, you're often more tech-savvy than the average Joe, and many of us enjoy tinkering with software. The customization you can achieve with Linux is hard to get on Windows. I use both Windows and Linux professionally and personally, and I find my workflow more enjoyable with Linux, especially if I can use my own system where I have every shortcut and functionality tailored by myself for myself. Can you elaborate? WSL feels just fine to me. Purely from a development standpoint, it doesn't matter if you program on Windows or Linux. You can program in C just as well on Windows as on Linux. In fact, in a lot of jobs, you are going to face the chimerical product that is Windows quite commonly. However, I'd still advise people to use Linux because it's actually the more convenient choice in university. If OP is studying something like CS, a lot of teaching materials and a lot of details, tools, and procedures are explained with Unix-Linux systems in mind. Windows is often a bit of an afterthought. Most computers in the department labs run some sort of Linux. The servers you have access to run Linux, etc. Like most things in the OS courses I took had examples from the Linux kernel in mind. We talked a lot about how the Linux kernel starts, how it manages process blocks and things like the Linux schedulers. But we only once mentioned the NT kernel's choice of a MLFQ scheduler as a subtask in an assignment. That was it. All tools used in random courses often kinda assume you have a bash terminal at hand to do stuff in, which is the norm in Unix or Linux systems, but not the norm in Windows. If OP is studying something like CS, a lot of teaching materials and a lot of details, tools and procedures are explained with Unix-Linux systems in mind. That depends on the university, really. Mine wasn't centered around any specific OS. All the courses were extremely OS agnostic. Same. We used Windows because that's what every PC at the college used. We didn't mention OS in any way during any programming course. For teaching, it's a lot easier to use Linux because the source is available to you and you can study it. You can't do this with Windows. Academia has always had a disconnect from what's out there in industry. Kubernetes on Windows versus Linux is night and day. IMO, that alone makes Linux better. What about Linux subsystem for Windows? You don't have to specifically run Linux on bare metal. Use a VM. Or Cygwin or MinW, both of which include enough goop to cover CS 101 near identically to Linux. POSIX.2 is what's important for command line and maybe some surface POSIX.1 stuff that can mostly be code defined D to the leftover DOS POSIX functions if aiming at MSVCRT directly. Using Chemder is really nice for Windows. You can do Git and a lot of pretty neat things like splitting the terminal in two with your favorite text editor, Notepad++, Sublime Text, etc., via console command. It's an awesome tool for productivity that blends some of the better commands from Linux and makes them available on Windows without Cygwin or WSL2. /cmder.app/cmder.app. I use Linux for work, but generally use the Windows image that came pre-installed on my laptop. This was mostly for easy C# programming without paying for Rider. But I'm more pretty good but not amazing IT than programmer, which is a distant goal at the moment. Using the terminal in Windows just feels wonky, and yes, that includes WSL. You should try PowerShell then, especially in the new Windows terminal, which isn't readily available on Windows Server, unfortunately. Windows Terminal is awesome. They finally got it right. I just wish they made it easier to install and keep updated on Windows Server, which is pretty much impossible, Adam. I use PWSH with Windows Terminal. I also use Oh My Posh to make it look nice, a bit nicer looking than the Linux terminal. When I need a tool only available on Linux, I use WSL. Even though WT looks better and they improved PWSH, here's my rant. It is slow as hell. Opening up a PWSH in WT with my theme takes 3 to 5 seconds. It measures this time itself. This is actually insane compared to Terminal on Linux, which is nearly instant on any machine. There's a difference between PowerShell and Windows PowerShell. Like, it feels so wrong. Just kill the useless one, please. Even though they improved the interface a lot, like an improved autocomplete, it still, after years, feels wonky compared to Linux. They're improving it and almost copying it from Linux, but still manage to make it feel less intuitive. Code find, name test, versus code get child item dash recurse filter test. Just physically hurts me. I cannot for the life of me remember these stupid push commands, while Linux just feels smooth. Then their idea difference between autocomplete with tab, or the suggestion it gives with history, which is nice, but uses right arrow, which feels garbage emo. Also, when I move to a previous command with arrow up, why is my cursor at the start of the command? In what scenario would I want my cursor at the start of the command when I use S previous command? Yay, I now use the end key automatically, but still, it's just painful. I can probably change it, but Linux gets this right out of the box. On Linux, almost all applications have a terminal headless version. Windows applications are sometimes required to be a view application. So most Linux applications can be completely controlled, and most of the time even better, via the terminal. If I need to do work on a Linux system, even if that includes developing, I can be completely comfortable with a headless system, terminal only. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy with Windows. Which terminal emulator are you using on Linux? I have used the Ubuntu standard GNOME and Terminator. Terminator is a bit more useful for daily use, but I didn't really like the look though. There's probably so more beautiful emulators that have the same easy screen splitting features. Both worked fine for me. Nothing really bothered me. I guess I don't understand the question. In the past 30 years, I have not deployed into production on anything but Linux. That being said, deployment and programming business logic are two different things. One thing I can say, unless you are programming for the Windows desktop, all scalable companies deploy to Unix, often Linux. In the past 30 years, I have not deployed into production on anything but Linux, pretty much. Even those with Windows servers are running Linux VMs or containers one way or another. For C and other native languages, it is a better experience and more like what you'll be using on the job, but there is Windows subsystems for Linux. For C and other native languages, I'm using Linux even for English. What about using Linux for HTML though? Is that a language? That's the joke. It is and it's not. Is that a language? That was my continuation of your joke. You can use Linux or WSL. This is the right answer. I used to partition, boot, host VMS, etc. with Linux, etc. for years. Now WSL is king. I'd suggest installing en.wikipedia.org wiki Windows subsystem for LinOSL instead. That will give you basically all the benefits of a real Linux development environment without having to worry about an unfamiliar GUI or hardware drivers or Linux system administration. While this is true, I highly recommend you learn Linux, even if very slowly, just because it's a good thing to know. It's probably not going to be the difference between getting a job or not, but if the job requires Linux, it will be less stressful if you already know a little about it. Agreed. Windows with WSL, Windows with Linux VM, and then if you're really into it, dual boot Windows and Linux, just Linux, if you won't need Windows outside of a VM again. As an experienced developer, it does not fucking matter. Just develop the software in time and well. Some C programs written in Windows won't work in Linux because of the header files. Additionally, Windows is a nightmare if you're going to use C libraries. Re won't work in Linux because of the header files. Do you have some examples? Anything involving code unisd.h or code windows.8 code are not cross-platform without proper guards and whatnot. Windows also has an entirely different API for working with sockets than most other platforms. Sleep in Windows uses milliseconds, while code sleep on Unix uses seconds. Not that any of these things are super breaking. They are just things you need to account for while you're trying to write system-independent C code. Outside of basic C programs, you will almost always have to sprinkle in code to tailor to Windows if you're supporting Windows, because Windows is just different. Op is in second semester of university. It's pretty safe to say that they aren't doing anything past the standard libraries, which for the most part should be completely compatible between Linux and Windows. I was answering the curious passerby who asked for an example of headers that are not cross-platform compatible. Game developer, yeah, adds up. C, C++, FYI, I would say no if your reason is to get schoolwork done. There are many reasons to use Linux, but you should prioritize getting work done as a student. I compare it to going to a good restaurant versus Taco Bell. TB is fine if you just want to fill your tummy. If your classes are too easy, then you might want to give Linux a run. Once you are in an IDE, there really doesn't make any difference if you're using Linux, Windows, or even OS X. The main benefit to Linux is it being easier to get started. The main detraction is that many industries might use proprietary tools or languages only available in Windows, or your place of work might only offer a workstation running Windows. My personal recommendation would be to play around. Use a virtual machine. Use a machine at the library. Experiment with different environments until you find something that fits your style. On the one hand, if you already know your way around Windows, it's worth expanding out into Linux. There's a lot of it out there, and it never hurts to have another platform under your belt. On the other hand, college courses move fast, and adding a new, unknown platform into the mix won't make things any easier. If you think you can realistically carve out the time you're going to need to learn the Linux environment, then definitely, but be realistic about how steep the learning curve is going to be. I'd recommend WSL to learn the basics of using the command line and how things work at a high level. Everything is a file, etc., because it's generally useful to be familiar with the platform. But no, you don't need to use Linux. I've done this for almost 8 years, and I'm the odd one out for preferring Linux. And many things that you have to do manually in Linux are automated through GUIs available on Windows and Mac OS. Just understanding the basic concepts of Linux and diving deeper when you need to should be sufficient. One thing that I've learned in the last year or so is that people telling you that you should use something full-time are using their choice of tooling as a way to prove how hardcore or smart they are. In some very rare cases, they'll have some valid reasons for talking that way, but for the most part, they're blowhards. Best of luck on your journey. On the other hand, installing packages, command line tools, running services is much simpler in Linux. Depends on who you ask. While installing tarballs is normally pretty straightforward, determining the best place to put them can be a bit weird depending on your distro, and the package you need might not be compatible on your distro. With Windows, you do have a bit of an easier time getting packages directly from maintainers. Windows has the registry, and I don't like it, but for the most part, MSI files will always install and .exe files will always run. I'm mostly talking about apt-get, Homebrew on Mac, or whatever other package manager. Pretty much any application tool you want to install, just sudo apt-get application. Rarely have an issue with it. Want nginx server, sudo apt-get nginx. Sudo systemctl start nginx. That's kind of my point. If you need an nginx server, knowing Linux fundamentals are important and will take you far. But if you're looking for a desktop OS and you're just trying to get your feet under you so you can write code, Windows is a more stable target. I can't tell you how often a package on Linux was out of date, but only on my OS, Discord, Slack, or how many times that a tool maintainer, Docker, specifically recommended circumventing the package manager because the changes made by the package maintenance team are substantial enough to change how the tools work. Sometimes, the package in your distro's repositories is so old that documented configuration settings simply don't work. Sometimes, the package management in the ecosystem is so broken that applications bundle their own update managers. Sometimes, your package manager defaults to snaps, and once you've installed it, you find that things simply don't work properly. Steam. Heck, this week my Postman installation on Manjaro broke because the package I was using got removed from the repositories. I know enough about using Linux to feel confident troubleshooting these issues, or in the worst case, finding workarounds and alternatives.